Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to our second webinar in our series based upon the U.S. Bishop's Pastoral Letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love. My name is Lynn Campbell, and I'm the Director of the Office for Catholic Social Justice Ministry, and we are overwhelmed by your interest and support in our webinar series. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. In their letter, the bishops recognize that racism comes in many forms, and that one of these forms is institutional racism. That is, when practices or traditions are upheld that treat certain groups of people unjustly. The bishops acknowledge that in order to understand how racism works today, we must recognize that generations of African Americans were disadvantaged by the systemic denial of access to numerous wealth-building opportunities. Our speaker tonight will help us to understand how this systemic racism has been working in our society. We will have questions and answers after the presentation. Please post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We cannot guarantee that we're going to get to many because we do have a full packed program tonight, but we'll do our best. Sarah Nickel, one of our board members, will be monitoring the questions throughout the evening. You will also notice on your screen, you should have a chat option. If you have general comments or need assistance, please use that box and address your comments to all attendees. We have some volunteers who will be monitoring that box as well. Before we get started, we'd like to begin with a prayer. And I'm going to share with you a prayer that is shared with us in the pastoral letter. The bishops have, U.S. Bishops Conference has put that prayer into a video format for us. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Chris Doucot. Chris is the founder with his wife, Jackie, of the Hartford Catholic Worker Community. He's also an adjunct instructor of sociology at several local universities, where he has taught race, class, and nonviolence. He is the author of the book, No Innocent Bystanders, Become an Ally in the Struggle for Justice. Chris didn't give me much of a bio to go by, but I can tell you I've known Chris for years, and Chris is passionate, he walks the talk, and really serves as a model of living the biblical values of peace and justice. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and welcome everybody. Before I begin, I just want to let folks know I'm nervous. This is a sensitive topic, and it will make some of us uncomfortable, but I'm also nervous because there's 201 of you who I can't see. And so I can't see your reactions, your body language, or the expressions on your face. So I'm a little bit nervous. Also, there is much more to say than I will be able to get to this evening. So I'm going to be leaving out much, and I'm not going to go into the sort of depth that I would prefer on the subjects I do bring up. I do have 3 goals for this evening. I want to briefly define race. I want to define systemic racism, and I want to have a brief consideration of systemic racism vis-a-vis the racial wealth gap and violence against Black people. And with that, I'm going to share my screen, which will have a series of PowerPoint images for the remainder of my presentation. Okay. So, in talking about what is race, let's start by asking this question. You maybe recognize this little girl by now, but is this girl Black? Is this girl white? These girls, Marcia and Millie Biggs, are actually twins, fraternal twins. But the question to ask ourselves is, will they be treated equally by our society? Or will one of them be seen as Black and face obstacles in her pursuit of the American dream? And will the other be seen as white and perhaps not face the same sort of scrutiny? Just some differences between Black and white women in America. The life expectancy for white women in America is 81 and a half years, 77 for Black women. The infant mortality rate for white people in America is 5 deaths for every 1,000 live births. For Black Americans, it's 11. Race is not biology. Race is ideology. That is, we have given meaning to our skin color, the shape of our nose, the texture of our hair. But like blood type, or whether or not we have a widow's peak or earlobes, our skin color is a feature of natural variation within the single human species. Instead, race is a set of ideas, it's meaning that we've attached to skin color. And these ideas have shaped our legal, social, and moral histories. These ideas have shifted over time, but persist nonetheless. So where does this come from? Where does the idea of race come from? Well, early on with the European conquest of North America, the Virginia Company needed cheap labor in order to turn a profit and to survive in a new land. They discovered that tobacco could be a very profitable crop, but since it was labor intensive to grow and harvest tobacco, they needed a large pool of cheap workers. The cheap labor initially consisted of indentured servants from Europe, European convicts, enslaved American Indians, and enslaved Africans. Early colonial laws referred to Christians or Englishmen rather than whites, reflecting the greater importance of religious or national differences. Around the time of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, new laws began to appear, separating enslaved Africans from European indentured servants. Bacon's Rebellion was the brief overthrow of the Virginia colonial government by Nathaniel Bacon and his militia of American Indians, indentured Europeans, and enslaved Africans. These groups were not yet called white and Black. These three groups occupied very similar social and class positions in colonial America, and they vastly outnumbered the politicians and the owners of plantations and businesses. As the importance of slavery grew, white began to replace Christian or Englishman in laws and in other social arenas, and slavery increasingly became associated with Blackness. That's what distinguishes slavery in America from slavery elsewhere. You will often hear people say, well, there's always been slavery, and that may well be true, but what to set American slavery apart is that it was racialized. Race was created as a justification for owning people. So the creation of race cleaved poor and working whites from enslaved Africans. By creating new racial identities, racial solidarity replaced class solidarity among the poor and working people in colonial America. Meanwhile, formerly indentured poor and/or working class whites became overseers of enslaved Africans. As time went on, they also formed a variety of slave patrols, some of which were formally organized as a form of proto-police force. According to the historian Gary Potter, slave patrols served three main functions. One, to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. Two, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And three, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who are subject to summary justice outside the law. Other slave patrols were vigilante groups, most notably the KKK, who took it upon themselves to keep Black people, quote unquote, in their place, especially in the wake of Reconstruction legislation, such as the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery except as punishment for a crime, the 14th Amendment, which created due process rights, and the 15th Amendment, which extended voting rights to Black men. The historian Drew Faust explains the changes happening in Southern society after the Civil War. She begins with the quote you see there on your screen from Mary Lee of Winchester, Virginia, who says at the end of the war, political reconstruction is inevitable now, but social reconstruction we have in our hands and we can prevent. Faust comments, that's such an extraordinary insight on her part and so predictive of much of what happens in the years that follow her remark. What she means is that Congress is going to do certain things, but there's almost a kind of guerrilla warfare of the local people just refusing to let society change in the ways that the architects of freedom in the North might hope for. Mary Lee's remarks are echoed today in the instances of white people, in particular recent instances of white women calling the police on Black people who are quote unquote out of place. Like when Amy Cooper called the police on Christian Cooper, no relation, in May. Christian Cooper was a Black man birding in Central Park and was out of place for asking Amy Cooper to leash her dog as was required in that part of the park. Or a couple of weeks later when socialite Svetlana Flom called the police on Pretty Brown, a Black woman, who was out of place sitting on a bench in the wealthy Upper West Side of Manhattan. Miss Brown could see her apartment from the bench she was sitting on. She was hardly out of place. So today we have the Black Lives Matter movement and the pushback of some whites who asked, don't all lives matter? One of the founding tenets of America is Jefferson's radical assertion that all men are created equal. But of course, Jefferson didn't declare women to be equal, nor did he think Black people were equal to whites. The deliberate use of the word all in both of these instances works to hide these realities, that all didn't extend to non-white people, that all didn't extend to women. By the time of the American Revolution, the ideology of race was nearly a century old. And with our country being founded upon the ideals of freedom and equality, slave owners like Jefferson had a problem. And so Jefferson called upon scientists to prove his suspicion, which you see there on the slide, that his suspicion that Black people were inferior in mind and body. And scientists did that with some junk science, measuring the size of skulls, etc. Jefferson was able to declare all men equal by declaring Black people to not be fully human. This explicit ideology of Black inferiority ipso facto launched the mirror ideology of white supremacy, made explicit in law and by groups like the KKK, but also persistently implicit in much, if not all, of white American life. Want to step back for 1 second to consider the idea of a social system. Racial oppression continues because of the social systems that we make happen. We make these systems happen by being socialized by our society. We are socialized by conforming to the mores of our society, by following the paths of least resistance. And when we do so, we perpetuate social systems. We perpetuate white supremacy by following the path of least resistance when it comes to race and racism in America. For example, not interrupting a racist joke when it's being told. Americans are thoroughly individualistic in our thinking and understanding of the world. An individualistic analysis of racism leads to a misunderstanding of how race functions and is reproduced. It also leads to some white people thinking they are not racist and thus not responsible, while other white people are labeled as racist and left defensive of themselves, their families, and their race. Systemic racism has resulted in America becoming a society that is white-centered, white-dominated, and white-identified. That is, and it's a society that is also largely controlled by white people. But I'm going to step back again for a minute. And I want us to put aside race for a minute and consider our transportation system so that we can see how a system of privilege works without falling into the traps of either being defensive or feeling above the problem. And so our transportation system, this is tough for a guy from Boston, our transportation system is car-dominated, car-identified, and car-centered. It is a system built by people with cars for other people with cars. Social systems, like our transportation system, don't fall from the sky. Rather, they are the result of deliberate policy and funding decisions. They are built and maintained by society, and they can be replaced, just like our rail-identified, dominated, and centered transportation system was replaced in the early 20th century. Now, if you own a car, you might not see how that gives you advantages in our society. In a system of privilege, members of the privileged class are often blind to both their privilege and the system that produces it. If you use your bike to commute to work, you see right away that the system was not built for cyclists. You're either too far into the traffic or you're too close to parked cars and have to worry about a driver opening their door. Try taking a left turn at a busy intersection on a bike. It's clear the system wasn't built for you. More pertinent is our public transportation system. Aside from places maybe like New York and Boston or Chicago, our public transportation system, if you use that, it's quite obvious to you that the system, our transportation system, wasn't built with you in mind. If you work second shift at the mall in Manchester, you will take the bus home to downtown Hartford and will sometimes find the bus from downtown to your neighborhood done running for the night. If you depend on the bus, where you live, where and when you work is dependent upon bus routes and bus schedules. A black woman I know from East Hartford, cleans homes in Avon. The commute takes her almost 2 hours. She has to take a bus from East Hartford to downtown Hartford, from downtown Hartford to Avon. Bus service to Avon is less frequent and it is less extensive because most people in Avon drive. If they take the bus, they're parking at a centralized commuter lot and taking the bus into the city. So once my friend gets to Avon, she then has to walk quite a distance to the homes that she cleans. And she will find herself walking on roads without sidewalks for much of the way. Sidewalks that I'm going to guess many motorists don't even realize are absent. When it comes to racism, a 2011 study by Harvard University found that a majority of white Americans believed at the time that they, or we, are more victimized by racial discrimination than Black Americans. I'm hoping that our consciousness has changed over the last several weeks on this issue. But this idea that white people are victimized by racism, that would be like car owners thinking that stopping for a jaywalker is worse than depending upon inadequate public transportation. In this context, the sociologist Michael Kimmel distinguishes between the psychological and the social experience. We live in a racist society that has benefited white people as a group over all other racial groups for centuries. And yet, there are still white people who are discriminated against or treated unfairly because they are poor and or gay and or Muslim and or disabled and or lacking citizenship status and or they are women, and on and on. And so individual white people may not be powerful, but the reality remains that white people are in power. There are instances when a white person may be discriminated against, and there are people of color who have a prejudice against white people, but racism is a matter of oppression that operates on both the individual level of discrimination and prejudice and the systemic level of social injustice, which is why you will sometimes hear people say that there is no such thing as reverse racism. Jaywalking pedestrians may have fleeting power, but they do not have the power and the advantages of car owners. And so, a racist society. America is a racist society. We are white dominated, white centered, and white identified. White dominated is obvious. I'll go through that in the next few slides with images put together by the New York Times. White centered means that in a racist society, the focus of attention is primarily on white people and what they do. Thus, we have Black History Month because the center of attention is white history. It doesn't have to be named, it just is. White identified means that in a racist society, the core cultural ideas about what is considered good, desirable, preferable, or normal are associated with how we think about whiteness and white people. So white dominated. So the New York Times back in 2016 put together this series called The Faces of American Power, right? So reading from the slide here, they reviewed 503 of the most powerful people in American culture, government, education, and business, and found that just 44 of these 503 people were not white. So the non-white people are highlighted in yellow at the bottom of each image. So you look at the leaders of the largest American companies. You will also notice, by the way, that these images skew significantly male. You can look at the cabinets of recent presidencies, where, frankly, President Obama, his cabinet was an outlier in terms of representation by women and non-white people. You look at the US Senate, an overwhelmingly white institution. You look at who's deciding which movies are made and which music is produced, overwhelmingly white people. You look at the mayors of the largest cities in America. Look at the mayors of the largest cities in Connecticut. Luke Bronin of Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, New Britain, Meriden, Middletown, New London, Stamford, Norwalk, all white people leading these cities that are majority non-white cities. Who decides which books we read? Dominated by white people. You look at the governor's mansions, dominated by white people. The owners of our professional sports teams, professional football teams, white dominated. So after seeing the difficulties of not having a car, a motorist could give up their car and gain some empathy with people who don't have a car, but bus service would still be inadequate because giving up one's car would not change the system. It would not produce structural changes. But when it comes to race, white people cannot give up our whiteness. Even if we were to pivot our center, a term coined by the Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins, by pivoting our center by entering into meaningful relationships with Black and brown people so that we could thus begin to see the world through their eyes. Even if we could do that, the world will still see us as white, and the system will still benefit us as white. So I want to share this image that I borrowed from a book on patriarchy, because patriarchy and racism are frankly very similar social systems. The work that much of our society does, or the understanding that much of our society has for racism, focuses on the leaves. The leaves are the individuals in society. The branches are the organizations, the communities, the families, the clubs that we belong to. The trunk consists of the institutions of society, the economy, the government, the family, the church. All of these are rooted in the core values, beliefs, and principles upon which our society is organized. Vis-a-vis racism, these roots are white control, white domination, white identification, and white centeredness. These roots are not always explicitly stated. Meanwhile, our explicit values, love, justice, equality, liberty, are not universally applied. Now, I want to give a heads up that some of the following slides will have violent, graphic, and otherwise offensive images. Try to resist the lyrics of the Confederate song, I Wish I Were in Dixie. Try to not look away from our past. So again, I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to shift gears a lot. I apologize for how that might make this disjointed. So when slavery ended, the ideology of white supremacy that justified slavery was not fully named and renounced. African Americans were still seen and treated as less than human. After emancipation, violence replaced slavery as the prevalent method of social control of Black people by the white majority. The Tulsa Massacre has gotten some recent attention with a piece on 60 Minutes and a reference in the HBO series The Watchmen, but it was hardly unique. There were other race massacres, of Black communities by white mobs in several cities around the country. These massacres were meant to keep Black Americans, quote unquote, in their place. They targeted Black businesses. They targeted the Black middle class. They targeted Black people who swam across a mythical line in Lake Michigan. They targeted Black people who asserted their human dignity. Lynching. Lynching was a widespread use of social control of Black people, particularly Black men. Black people weren't the only groups lynched, but by far they were the group most lynched in America. And I worry that lynching is coming back in our country. A new report from the Equal Justice Initiative found that there were over 2,000 lynchings just during Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. Their earlier report from a few years back documented more than 4,400 racial terror lynchings. When these lynchings happened, by the way, white families often gathered with their children, wearing their church clothes, packing a lunch. They often took photographs and had those photographs turned into postcards that they mailed to friends and family around the country. Think about that for a minute. And think about if we were talking about child rape. Could you imagine taking your child to witness that and eat lunch, to take photographs of it and feel confident that the film would be developed, the printer would print the postcards, and the post office would deliver it, and your family would accept getting a postcard of you witnessing, frankly, participating in a child rape? To be present at a lynching is to be complicit, is to participate in it. To have the post office delivering it really indicts American society in the horrific history of lynching. Lynching was used to keep Black men from having relationships with white women. As recently as 2009, an interracial couple was denied a marriage license in Louisiana. It was not until Loving versus the state of Virginia decision of 1967 that laws against interracial marriages were declared unconstitutional. This violence is a way of protecting whiteness, of protecting white power and white wealth. Jesse Jackson, Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, and others have argued that capital punishment is the state-sponsored echo of lynching today. Of course, lynchings haven't ended. The killings of Black men and women by the police and by vigilantes like George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin, and Gregory and his son Travis McMichael, who killed Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020. Those were also lynchings. All right, I'm going to shift gears again, kind of abruptly. I'm sorry. So here in the North, we often have this notion that we were the land of the free, and that we were not as deeply implicated in the founding sin of slavery. And that is completely untrue. The economy of the North, and frankly, the entire US economy, was entangled with slavery and profited from slavery. Slave money built churches and funded charities, provided jobs to coopers, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, and rum distillers, paid for political campaigns. You could invest in slave holding companies or in individual slaves on Wall Street. If you didn't own slaves yourself, you could own a portion of a slave. We have the example of US Senator James DeWolf, at the time the second richest man in America. His family's fortune was built upon the kidnapping and the selling of 10,000 African people and the wealth that they built. The DeWolf family fortune and the American economy depended upon slavery. After the end of slavery, the wealth created by the enslaved labor of Black people, but held by white people, was not redistributed. In fact, white Americans were provided with more mechanisms with which we could build transgenerational wealth. So, for example, we had the Homestead Act of 1862, which opened up millions of acres of land for white male ownership. This was also on paper open to Black people, but in practice, Black people were largely prevented from getting homestead parcels. We did have, fleetingly, the 40 acres. General Sherman's Field Order 15, which was approved by President Lincoln, provided 40,000 freed Black men with 400,000 acres of land on a strip of coastline in South Carolina to Florida. But by June of 1865, there was 400,000 acres in Black ownership. By the fall, President Johnson, who had succeeded Lincoln, returned all of that land to white plantation owners. And the wealth tied up in that land, it's transgenerational. It alters the trajectory of the lives of white people and their descendants. You will sometimes hear people say, well, that's all ancient history. It's irrelevant because the Great Depression was the great equalizer. And in many ways, the Great Depression did some equalizing, but not really across racial lines. Some of the New Deal legislation that came out of the Great Depression went a long way to help to create a middle class. The Wagner Act, which made legal collective bargaining, but it also made legal the exclusion of non-white people from unions. The Social Security Act, which included unemployment insurance and retirement insurance and disability insurance, didn't cover domestic work and agricultural work, which 40% of Black workers worked in those two jobs, industries. And the GI Bill for returning veterans, again, provided mortgages, low interest business loans, college education. And again, on paper, Black people were eligible for it, but in practice, they were denied it. We have the Great Migration of African Americans. It happened in two waves after each of the two world wars, of Black people leaving the South, largely for the Midwest and the Northeast, but also out to California. This is important for us to think about the effects of that other great New Deal legislation, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which altered the way Americans came to own homes. Prior to the Great Depression, prior to the FHA, most Americans didn't own a home because it was simply too expensive to do so. You had to come up with half the price of the home for a down payment, and a loan, a mortgage, was maybe 5 years. Only the very wealthy could do that. The FHA transformed the ways in which people buy homes in America to the way that we have it pretty much today. You can put down 10, 15, 20% and have a mortgage that was 10, 15, 20, or 30 years long. And so your monthly mortgage payment was competitive or even cheaper than a rent payment. And so as Black people were moving to the Northeast and to the Midwest, white people were leaving those city neighborhoods where the Black folks were moving into, and they were moving to the newly created suburbs. When these FHA mortgages were granted, there was reports and maps that were used. Every neighborhood in the country was surveyed. And this is where the term redlining comes from. Maps were colored in different shades, blue, yellow, green, red. Red being labeled hazardous, neighborhoods that had been, quote unquote, infiltrated by the Negro element of the most undesirable type, end quote. Those neighborhoods, mortgages were not being made to people in those neighborhoods. So Black people moving into the city were unable to get mortgages to buy the homes that were being vacated by white people. The best guarantee, or the lowest risk for mortgages, were the new suburbs, single family homes, single use neighborhoods, right? No industry, no businesses, suburbs, and especially no people of color. And so when Black people from the Great Migration were moving north, they were either paying rent to the white people whose home they were now occupying, and that rent was paying the mortgage, or those homes were sold off to large absentee landlords. This was an incredibly effective wealth building program. It created a middle class. However, it created a white middle class. Between 1934 and 1962, the FHA guaranteed $120 billion worth of mortgages. 98% of those mortgages went to white people. This is how segregation in housing is entrenched in American society. There are other practices like covenants and deed restrictions, which wrote into the language of the deed that Black people or non-white people couldn't buy a house or couldn't move into a neighborhood. There was the practice of block busting, where real estate agents and some developers would hire Black women with children to walk around the neighborhood in baby carriages to scare white people into selling. There's the practice of racial steering, white people to white neighborhoods and Black and brown people to Black and brown neighborhoods. When my parents moved our family when I was in middle school, we ended up in an entirely white neighborhood in an entirely white town. I do not remember any black or brown classmates in my new school. The move was only 5 miles. We went from being 5 miles out of downtown Boston to 10 miles out of downtown Boston. In this town, many new developments were being built and only white people were moving in. Again, this was the effects of racial steering by real estate agents, but also the effect of limited public transportation. This town that I lived in repeatedly voted down proposals by the MBTA to extend bus service to the town. And so despite anti-discrimination laws passed in the wake of the civil rights movement, Black and brown people are still experiencing discrimination in lending today. The Bank of America and Wells Fargo are currently paying out fines worth several hundred millions of dollars for predatory and racist lending practices. I'm skipping ahead, going fast because I'm running out of time. So this is the home that my family bought in 1981 for $81,000. They sold this home in 2008 for $450,000. And with that, they gave me $5,000, which I used to buy my son a car so that my son could look for work wherever he wanted, and he could work whenever he wanted. That transfer of wealth, that inheritance is taking place across America right now as baby boomers are selling their homes and funding their retirements, their vacations, making bar mitzvah, confirmation, graduation, wedding gifts with that money. That's a massive transfer of wealth that is happening, and it's largely a white transfer of wealth. My son's friends from the north end of Hartford, their grandparents, when they moved north from during the Great Migration, they weren't able to buy homes. Their great-grandparents weren't able to get FHA mortgages. And so after 30 years of paying rent, they didn't have the equity of $500,000. They had a shoebox full of rent receipts. My point being that a practice that was no longer explicitly racist was still having a profound racial impact to this day in the way that it's benefiting my son's generation and his white cohort. And so you look at the racial wealth gap in America, and it is stunning. It's even more stunning if you look at Boston, for example. In 2018, the Boston Globe ran a series on race, and they identified the median wealth, not income, but wealth. The median wealth of white families in Boston is $248,000. The median wealth for Black families in Boston is $8. $248,000 for white families, 8, not 8,000. 8 for Black families. That's largely the result of the housing market and who owns homes and who doesn't. I can't find figures for Hartford, but I'm going to guess that a similar disparity exists in Hartford. And so this photograph here is of the front door of one of the apartment buildings in our North End neighborhood. Right? Police take notice, no loitering, no trespassing, tenants included. Right? And so I bring this up to just think again in terms of the far-reaching impact of the FHA. So white kids in the suburbs use drugs and sell drugs at similar rates to Black and brown kids in the city, but they're not getting pulled over. They're not getting hassled for loitering or trespassing in their own homes. Whereas Black kids in Hartford on the front porch of their apartment building are being hassled by the police. And if they're arrested for drug possession, they have the drug possession charge, a loitering and trespassing charge, and they live in a drug-free school zone by virtue of living in a city. Kids in the suburbs, very few of them will live in a drug-free school zone because the suburbs are less densely populated. And so if by some bad fortune the suburban kid gets arrested, he only has the drug charge. The city kid has 3 charges. And when 95% of all criminal cases in America end in plea deals, end in a guilty plea, basically, the prosecutor has a stronger hand in dealing with somebody with 3 charges than somebody with 1 charge. All right, I'm just about done here, folks. So I want to step back from race and just introduce folks, if you're not familiar with this notion of the sociological imagination. This is a term coined by C. Wright Mills, right? Simply, it means the intersection of biography and history, right? And so if we're going to think about race and we're going to think about our lives as white people, and we want to try to compare our lives with the lives of Black people and ask ourselves, well, if I did this, why couldn't they do that? If I don't get in trouble for drugs or I don't get arrested, why can't they not get arrested? If I did well in school, why can't they do well in school? We can't think about our biographies or other people's biographies outside of the context of the history of our nation and the ways in which that history impacts our different biographies. So we have talk these days, finally, of truth and reconciliation. But before reconciliation can be sought, white America needs to reflect on white supremacy. Not simply the acts of overt racists in white robes, but also on our complicity with a social system that is white-centered, white-identified, and white-dominated, whereby whites as a whole have disproportionate power, control, and wealth. We need to reckon with our history of slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, medical apartheid, and more. We need to repent for the harm of that history, both yesteryear and yesterday. And we need to repair what can be repaired. We need to overcome the racial wealth gap. We need to overcome discrimination in banking, employment, policing, education, housing, and more. We need to stop looking at racism as solely a problem with individuals. Racist acts and racist individuals operate within racist social systems. C. Wright Mills spoke of the sociological imagination as the intersection of biography and history. Let's engage our sociological imaginations to understand the world we inherited. And let's deploy our moral, political, and prophetic imaginations to build the world as it should be. And in my mind, this is the work of resurrection. This is how we participate in the resurrection. This idea of remembering, right? To remember, to put the body of Christ, the mystical body of Christ, back together. We are not a healthy body. We are not a healthy church so long as parts of that body are suffering from the violence of racism and poverty. And I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Chris. Certainly a lot of information for you to be sharing with us, a lot of information for us to be absorbing, especially if this is the first time we're hearing a lot of this. I think it's easy to become defensive, and we really need to just sit and listen to this for a bit, let it sink in. So there are a few questions that came up, so I'm going to bring Sarah onto the screen and have her raise those questions for us.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Chris. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions that were actually sent in before the talk, but I think you might have touched on them a little bit, but I think it dovetails perfectly with how you ended the talk, Chris, which is to ask about, can you share some advice about how we have genuine and respectful conversations that's not stifled by, sort of fear of saying the wrong thing despite good intentions?
Sure. I think we need to practice shalom. Hebrew word typically translated as meaning peace, which is accurate but imprecise. It more precisely means right relationship. White people need to seek right relationships with non-white people in our society. And we need to do that work. I'll make it the metaphor of getting the Eucharist. We go to the Eucharist. We don't wait for it to come to us. White people have an affirmative obligation to go to non-white people to seek meaningful relationships in the social arena, in our workplaces. Maybe we need to reconsider where we live so that we can have these relationships, because it's only going to be in the context of those loving and trusting relationships that we will be able to have these conversations and not be afraid of saying the wrong thing.
I think, so there was also a question on a related note about, I think people want to know how white people can be allies. I think probably on an individual level, one person asked, but also maybe from steps that a parish could take. If you have thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I think communities need to interrogate their histories. Holy Cross College, where I went to school, which at the time started off as a school of Georgetown University, they've begun interrogating their history and how Georgetown University saved itself by selling some enslaved people. And knowing that history, they've begun to make some act of reparation to the descendants of those people that were sold. So we need to interrogate our histories, interrogate the histories of our faith communities, interrogate the histories of our communities. Do we live in a town that had restrictive housing covenants? One of the slides I put up there showed language about the covenants that were in place in West Hartford. Do we live in a town that was once a sundown town? A town, some of these towns had signs at the border, like Kiwanis signs, letting Black people know they needed to leave town before the sun went down if they wanted to live. We need to interrogate that history so that we know it. We need to be supporting the leadership of Black people that are working for meaningful change in our society. So something like drug-free school zones sounds like a great law, right? It's meant to protect our children. But the truth of the matter is drug-free school zones are harming our children by making their parents unemployable by giving them these extra charges. Can we at least interrogate that? Think about that. You know, many of us got stimulus checks. Many of us don't need those checks. You know, maybe we can use those checks as a small act of reparation, funding some Black-led initiative or spending it on a Black-owned business.
Chris, I just want to mention that you're getting a lot of positive comments about your presentation. So I just wanted to let you know that as they're rolling in here.
Thank you.
I think, you know, another question got to the point of, you know, it really shouldn't be a surprise to learn that the Catholic Church is opposed to the sin of racism. So how do we communicate this more with others, maybe of our faith, but perhaps of other faiths too, that, you know, I'm a Catholic and I believe that racism is a sin?
Well, we have to do two things. Our Pope has been wonderful. He's been saying things about race and racism that I think would make many white Americans blush. He's been so forthright. And I think we need to get our faith leaders to be reproducing those statements in our church bulletins. We need to be having these conversations in small groups in our parishes. We need to be asking our Catholic high schools to be talking explicitly about race in this way. But we also have to acknowledge and own and repent for the ways in which our church was complicit in racism. You know, and the complicity is extensive. You just look up the history of the boarding schools that the church ran for American Indians here in the United States, in Canada, but also in Australia and New Zealand. It was a form of genocide, frankly.
Lynn, I think I wanted to ask you, we're getting near to 8 o'clock. Do we have time for another question, or should we wrap up with some sort of final thoughts?
one quick question and then we could wrap it up.
Sure, great. Just going through and make sure we get sort of a new one here. I think, there's a good question too about Catholic leadership and being primarily white in the US, and how can the Catholic Church change its own white-centeredness?
Yeah, particularly since we're not a white church. The idea that the Catholic Church is white is really tunnel vision on the part of American Catholics. The Catholic Church is largely non-white. We need to broaden our perspective, I guess. We need to read. I'm a professor. I don't think people read enough. We need to read more, people. One point I'd like to make, please, since I see it's only 7:56 and I got 4 minutes. This idea of slavery and the idea that it ended so long ago, I want to point people to a book called Slavery by Another Name, written by Douglas Blackman. And he talks about after the end of slavery and slave codes being abolished, new laws were written called Black Codes that made it illegal in some places for Black people to gather without a white person present, to learn how to read, to Black maids couldn't leave the homes of their bosses without their permission. If you couldn't prove you had a job, you were breaking the law. And this led to, or this is the beginnings of the myth of Black criminality, that Black people are more prone to criminal behavior, because it led to large numbers of arrests of Black people, particularly healthy young Black men. And they weren't imprisoned. Instead, their sentences were sold to plantation owners, to coal mine operators, to the U.S. Steel Corporation. And they worked off those sentences. Very often they never made it back to freedom because they died. This practice of slavery by another name continued into the middle of the 20th century. It continued into the lifetime of my parents. Slavery is not ancient history.
I'm glad you mentioned the book suggestion, because someone did have that question. I'm kind of sneaking the question in here, Lynn. But to the point of more book suggestions, I believe that we have some on the website. Lynn, is that correct?
Yes, we do. On our website, we have racial justice resources, and there's a book list that's available there. And we will certainly add Slavery by Another Name to that list, as well as Chris's book is very good too.
Thank you.
So,
well, I hope you have the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander on that list as well.
We do. We do. The film 13th, Brian Massengill videos, we have great. But take a look. If you have other suggestions for us, we'd gladly add them to it. So want to just let you know again, Chris, we're seeing so many positive, they're all positive, but a lot of people who just really want to express what their gratitude for your presentation. It's challenging to speak to a screen and cram all this in an hour, and you did just a wonderful job. We really appreciate it. I am going to conclude by asking everyone if they wouldn't mind, as soon as the webinar is over, you will receive a quick survey. That survey is going to ask you how we as an office can help you further along in this journey, help your parish move along on this journey of conversion. I also ask you to register for our next webinars. Each one you have to register separately. You know, the bishops tell us in their letter that we really need to listen, right? Build relationships. And the next two webinars are about listening. We have Deacon Art Miller coming on August 5th for a conversation about his Black Catholic experience and racism in the Catholic Church. And then later on August 19th, we have 4 women from across the diocese who are sharing their stories of what it is like for them to be Black and Catholic. So good stuff coming up. In the meantime, please just, take your time to sit with this, pray over this. It's a lot, and we need to just take it to heart. Thank you again for joining us, everyone, and I wish you good night and good blessings.